welcome to the ImpactWayv podcast, Making a Difference. And I'm your host, Dominique Easley. And today I am joined by Dr. Rachel Cavallaro, if I'm saying that correct.
Yes,
Cavallaro,
you are. Thanks, Dominique.
who I met on ImpactWayv. Doctor, she's also studied trauma as an MP in combat zones. So please tell us all about you.
All right. Well, thank you. So,
Problem.
I've always known that I wanted to be in psychology. I've always been a very curious person and curious about other people and the way they think and why we're all so different and the things that also make us very similar. And so, in order to do that, of course, I needed to go to college. I didn't have the means to do that originally, and my family couldn't send me to college. So I joined the military when I was 17 so that I
Thank
could put myself through college.
you.
And originally my contract was for 8 years. So I did that contract. And towards the end of that, I had been with this one unit, military police unit, for 5 years, training with them, leading them. Really, it was like a second family for me. And then we got orders to go to Afghanistan. And so I was supposed to get out. However, there was just no way that I could get out at that time. I just felt this really overwhelming sense of obligation, like I had to go. It didn't even feel like a choice for me at that time. So I extended my contract for a couple more years just so I can deploy with that unit. And part of it too was, well, I can get that experience. And when I come home, I can work with veterans and I can really bridge this gap between civilian and military personnel and really help them in a more effective way. So I did that, went to Afghanistan. I was accepted into grad school while I was there, which was crazy. And a month after I came back, I started grad school. So that was a bit of a transition there.
I bet.
And then since then, I've been working in a variety of different contexts. So inpatient, outpatient, maximum security, forensic hospitals. I worked at the VA doing neuropsychological assessment. I specialize in cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm certified from the Beck Institute in order to do therapy, as well as prolonged exposure therapy, which is one of the highest evidence-based treatments for PTSD in particular. And I also got trained in cognitive processing therapy, which is another one of the gold standard treatments that the VA uses in treating veterans. And interestingly, along the way, thinking about treating the veteran population, I knew I had to be well-versed in trauma. Mm-hmm. And I also knew what co-occurs with trauma is addiction. And so initially, I started down this path of becoming familiar with substance use. And really, honestly, at the time, it was a check the box for me. I need to have the foundational skills to do the work, to understand it, to be a good clinician. However, I fell in love with the work. There was just something about working with those individuals that it was very fulfilling. It was very challenging, very fulfilling, and it just seemed to be a good fit for me. So I ended up specializing in addiction. I got my master addiction credential. I did my early internship and postdoctoral fellowship in addiction as well.
Hey, well, you have congratulations.
Thank you.
You have accomplished a lot. Well, one of my questions, not to, I guess, totally get off topic. I guess, how did that help transition? I guess more so the education from school to actual real life, in the positions that you were in, being overseas and in the military, because those are more so reactions that you have to now take.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So my military service was prior to grad school. So it was more of transitioning from a soldier at that time to a civilian and a provider afterwards. And my degree is a PsyD. I'm not a PhD. And the difference there is a PsyD is more clinically based. I always knew, much like my military career, I was a staff sergeant. I wasn't an officer. I was an enlisted member. And much like that, on the clinical civilian side, I wanted to be on the front lines. I wanted to be with the people. I wanted to be doing the work. I didn't want to be in a lab. I didn't want to do research. I wanted to be the one out there making a difference every day. So that really dictated the school that I went to. I went to the University of Hartford at Connecticut. It's where I'm from. I wanted to stay locally. And it was the only school, it was the only option that had that program. And so in that program, very clinically focused again, it's more focused on being able to do the skills effectively and getting trained in different clinical settings and therapies, as well as providing psychological assessment. So that's kind of how that happened and where that transition was.
Okay. Yeah, and the reason for that question was a lead up to kind of talking about the brain injuries and the
Mm.
similarities between athletes and veterans. And it's crazy because I just literally had this conversation with a veteran that was in infantry, and he just recently retired from the military and the police force, and he's working on his PTSD and everything like that. And this came from my kids my kids' friends, and we wound up going over there for a bonfire. You know what I mean? So we
Yeah.
started really getting into the similarities, and I started to really realize it's like we we kind of go through the same thing, but just and I give more so credit to the military because y'all they are on more life or death reactions, compared to yes, we have a lot of physical abuse coming to us as well, but
Sure.
it could be life or death, but it's not directly life or death. You know what I mean?
Well, that's
So
not what you're signing up for, right?
yeah, exactly, exactly. So it's I guess we had a lot of conversations to compare to our training camps. Like what does the training camp do to us
Mhm.
physically and also mentally? And that's something that we really connected on because we had to realize like we really had to, I guess, learn how to break ourselves out of not being broken.
Right.
And that is that is not supposed to happen within a couple of weeks. So it's something that we go through, but we're not supposed to be talking about. We're not supposed to be conversating or complaining about, is what they say.
Right.
So that really hit it on the head when we was having that conversation, and just even now after the fact, right? The symptoms that we have, the headaches, living with headaches,
Yes.
um, blurred vision, still having to get up slowly because sometimes we're dizzy, you know what I mean? Like those constant knock into our head gave us so much trauma that we wasn't realizing that was causing trauma. All we was doing what we was told to do.
Doing what you're told to do, of course.
Exactly. Um, yeah, and I guess for you, I say I would ask more so I guess what have you seen that was similar compared to you being around athletes and you being around your field?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and this is where the psychological assessment comes in because I'm doing a lot of neuropsychological testing. So for
Hmm.
some people, it is, for military personnel, it's following blast injuries and seeing like what are the residual effects of, this injury and how is your brain healing. Now, for minor brain injuries, like, your standard run of the mill concussion, not so much a big deal. The brain is very resilient, and you can recover that from that usually within a month. And then if it persists after a month, then you're looking at something called post-concussive disorder, right? And that's more so caused less from the injury, but the effects from it. So it could either be mental health complications or it could be ongoing like muscle tension or skeletal disruptions, but it's not necessarily the head injury per se.
Yeah.
Now,
And,
we're thinking about more of the major head injuries, right? These are very different because they have lasting effects,
I
right?
apologize.
That's okay. And as you know, right, it's not even the first one that's really the problem. And it's not the first hit that causes the damage. It's the repeated hits afterwards, right? And I mean, especially in football, I mean, you're getting hit repeatedly. And even when somebody gets knocked down, right? So you have the blunt force of getting hit and then getting knocked down, right? There's another one. So you're causing more damage to the brain in that way. And so the good thing is that there's been more focus on this, and people have been more intentional as we've had more awareness brought to this. And it seems like they've really changed the protocols related to head injuries, both in contact sports as well as the military. So when you get hit or you have a head injury, you're, on the military side, you're pulled from duty at least for a while until things kind of go back to normal. You get medical clearance. I know that they're doing that in high schools as well, and of course, in your experience, probably in the NFL as well.
Yeah, they definitely have taken a big leap on the protection of guys' heads, even like you said, down to the high school level, even down to the Pee Wee level. The type of equipment that is now being used compared to when I first started playing football, which was in high school, 2010. There wasn't as much padding. Like the less padding was better because you can move faster. But now
Right.
see this extensive padding, but they made it to where it is now, I guess, comfortable and playable, and being able to, I guess, be at your best ability by doing that extensive research that they have been doing over the last couple of years, and just to, I guess, sit on the fact of the continuous hitting and hitting and hitting to your head, that brings trauma to outside of, uh, I guess, the sport, right? Sleeping. For me personally, I haven't slept for more than 4 hours since I probably started playing football, and that's a big part of life is sleep. Like
Gosh.
you need sleep to recover. And for me, I realized that was a big part of my injuries as well. Not being able to sleep, not being able to fully recover the way I was supposed to fully recover. And that took part in why my career took I guess, the way that it went. So it's definitely, I say it's definitely very, very important to continuously hit on the fact of that we have a lot of issues going on while we're in this state, and we have to start taking these protocols even more serious, I guess, personally, you know
Mhm.
so it's it's interesting to see where the world is at with mental health compared to where we was at when we first started this you know
Yeah, it's certainly coming along, and I'm sure this is the same for you, and I experienced it too. It's just kind of like this tough guy attitude, like you suck it up and you drive on. I took a PT test with a completely sprained ankle, so my military physical fitness test, because I didn't want anybody to know that I actually hurt my ankle, and I still did, still scored a perfect 300 and everything, but running 2 miles on an injury, like that's not tough, that's foolish. And there's
yes,
a big difference, right? So being tough is like, all right, it's a little cold out, I'm just going to push through it, versus doing something where you put yourself in harm, right?
and,
So
and
big difference here between being tough and being foolish.
exactly, and that leads to one thing that we're not taught to be is vulnerable, because that and that is looked so down upon, being
Right.
what you would use as tough. So being vulnerable, learning how to be vulnerable, and learning, I guess, the person that we're trying to be vulnerable to, learn how to receive that. And that's something that's not being talked about. Yeah, we're talking about our mental health, about us being vulnerable. We also have to have that conversation with the receivers on how to receive that and how to empathize with that. So it's being, I guess, being vulnerable in an athlete's world compared to a veteran or a person that's in the active military is something that I feel like has to be taken serious and has to really be hit upon.
Hmm. Exactly. I mean, vulnerability is the precursor to connection.
Mhm.
It really is. That's how we connect. And we're social beings. We need to connect to one another. And I think the pandemic in the last 2 years has really brought to light how serious our needs of connection are, because people are just so isolated. And there's a difference here between being alone and loneliness. Like being alone is a choice. Like sometimes I need space. I'm a bit more introverted. I like to recover, wind down on my own. If I'm hanging out with people for a long period of time, that's a choice. But loneliness, you could feel it in a room full of people and you just don't feel connected. And some of that stems from these underlying feelings of unworthiness. Like I am unworthy of connection. And therefore I kind of take myself out of that. Right. And I'm certainly afraid to be vulnerable because then people will see how unworthy I truly am. Now, these are not truths. These are the negative things that our brain will tell us, especially if you're struggling with depression or just low self-esteem, that we really have to work on correcting. And if we can be vulnerable with one another and I make it safe to be vulnerable and I show you that I'm vulnerable, well, it certainly makes it more safe for you to be as well.
Exactly. And that brings into one of those main factors is trust, being able to trust somebody, while they're going through grief, losses in their life, whether they're being domestically abused, whether they're being emotionally abused. How can I trust you to give you this information that makes me extremely vulnerable? You know, so it's a serious factor. Vulnerability is something that we have to start hammering down into people. Period.
Mhm. Mhm. I couldn't agree with you more. And again, it's really being able to hold that space and being able to be more comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. Now, being vulnerable doesn't mean we all have to become therapists here.
Exactly.
That's unrealistic, right? It's just about being authentic is really what we're talking about here, and not kind of shirking away if somebody's talking about their emotions. I mean, people treat emotions like there's something to be feared, and as we fear our emotions, we maintain some of these really negative patterns that we get stuck in. Our emotions are not feared, and I will tell you something that probably don't hear very often. Emotions are data. So they tell us everything we need to know. And the problem is we're not listening. People are not listening to what your emotions are telling you, right? So when you're lonely, you feel sad. Sadness drives connection. That uncomfortable feeling, like sadness doesn't feel great, but it's motivating you to reach out. Even though it feels hard, that is what it's telling you to do. And when you're scared, right, you're seeking safety. And when we're angry, there's a barrier, there's something in our way. That's why we get so energized,
Yep.
right? Anger helps us like go to bat for whatever it is. And so it helps you overcome obstacles. So it's recognizing, what are my emotions telling me here?
Yeah.
Right? And then assessing situation, right? It's like, even if I'm afraid to be vulnerable, what am I so afraid of? Is that
Exactly.
accurate?
And how do you dictate? I guess that I say, let me run it back. I say that's one of the things that I had to deal with personally is understanding my emotions, right? Because I'm a person who didn't came from a single mother home, and she had to raise two boys in the projects. So
Yeah.
there was at that point in time, right? My mother, she didn't understand mental health, so there was no
You're in
space.
survival mode. How could you?
Exactly. And there's no space for emotions. There's no space to for my mother to even understand how to practice gratitude. You know what I mean? From her, because she has her trauma that she still hasn't dealt with. So
Right.
it's how do you break that generational curse of understanding and being empathetic towards people, I guess situations in a way, because I wouldn't even say trauma, because it's what are you going through at that moment and how to understand what you're going through and work through that. And those people that, like I said, the people that's receiving it, how to give that gratitude, how to give that empathy, like how to take that, how to receive that from that person so that person can now walk in the light of positivity of what they're going through. And and that's what we're all working towards. That's what we're definitely all working towards. And I guess doing things that make us feel positive, that put good energy into us, working out, being able to express that physically as well, you
Mhm.
know. So it's definitely something that we are understanding that comes with dealing with mental health is physical health as
Yes.
well.
Yes.
You know, it's definitely physical health, and that's something that I had to understand when I first retired. Is that I needed to continue my workout regimen
Oh my
because
gosh. Yeah.
once I stopped, I felt like okay, now I'm retired. Now I want a break. That put me more in the funk. That put me more in the depression mode. That put me more.
Definitely.
That gave me more anxiety. So that being able to keep on my diet, being able to exercise, being able to work on myself to get better mentally is something I had to learn from my experience of transition. You know.
Hmm. Absolutely. And, so bringing that up and circling back to something that you mentioned before, what I consider the trifecta, or really the foundation for physical, mental health, overall well being, three things. So, one you already talked about, sleep, and the one you're bringing up now, exercise, and you even mentioned diet.
Hmm.
Without these three things, right, we can't even try to become vulnerable or regulate ourselves because we need to focus on our basic functions. Right? We need good sleep. We need to stay active. We know that exercise is so helpful for us physically and mentally. And really, your diet, I think it's something people only think about that in terms of weight loss,
Yep.
but our diet is so much. I mean, we have to eat every day, right?
Exactly.
And what you choose to put in your body, you can either nourish it or poison it,
Yep.
right?
And the only way we'll find that out is by what asking for help. Asking the I guess the people who have done it, the experts.
Hmm.
And that's one thing that we have to get used to because we're not used to asking for help. Because if you ask for help, you're looked at as being weak.
Right, right. And so that's where the vulnerability can be so helpful, in reaching out. So if you're somebody noticing that a loved one or a friend is just not acting the same, or isn't responding, or keeps canceling their plans, and that's abnormal, that's when you want to have these conversations. Like, hey, is everything okay? You don't seem like yourself. Are you struggling with anything? Do you want to talk about it? And again, the idea here is you don't have to solve any of these issues for anybody. It's about being open to listening
Yep.
and letting that other person know, like, I'm human too, right?
Mhm. Yep.
So there's all kinds of organizations that you can look into as well to get help. Like, so NAMI is a big one, the National Alliance on Mental Health, and if mental illness, rather. If you are concerned about either yourself or a loved one, you can check that out. They have all kinds of resources available to help you navigate that process. And there's this great video on their website about what to look for if somebody is struggling with their mental health.
Yeah, no, definitely take a look at the resources that we have available for you guys, and really take advantage of it. Go do your research, see whatever's comfortable for you guys, and go take advantage of it because it's needed and it's gonna help. Um, and that will help you understand what you're going through, right? And that brings me to my next question for you. And this is something that I had to realize that I heard a lot and I hear a lot going around is people diagnosing themselves
Whew.
just randomly, right? That's something that I've heard a lot. And then that's something I also know that I guess that's a pet peeve of yours. So when it
Oh,
comes
yeah.
to that, please, please, we would love to hear on how to help people understand what is an actual diagnosis.
Mhm. I can't tell you the amount of therapy sessions that have started with, so I saw this on TikTok or I Googled this and,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this is more like, oh, geez, here we go, right? So a diagnosis is so much more than a cluster of symptoms. So let me say that. Many of us can look at these symptoms, like, ADHD is a big one, and a lot of what the assessments I do are related to ADHD, and people are having problems with inattention, concentration, getting distracted, losing interest in things that are boring. Well, I would say probably 99% of us can meet that criteria. Now the difference is, what sort of impairments are you experiencing? And so when we think about mental illness, we know that people have a diagnosis when there are true impairments in their life. It's not, I feel sad, so I'm depressed. No, when I'm depressed, I can't focus. I don't have the energy to do anything. I'm lethargic. I'm irritable. I hate myself, right? I feel worthless. I feel helpless. And the final symptom of depression is suicide. And people forget this so much because we throw around depression like it's the common cold, really just for mental illness. But depression is not that. It is a very serious mental illness. It is extremely debilitating. And no, it doesn't look like somebody not getting out of bed. However, it could be not brushing your teeth, not taking a shower for days, not cleaning up your house or doing these basic things. Again, not responding to calls or text messages, feeling overwhelmed with small tasks. So knowing that you have to respond to emails and that just feels like too much energy. So you can't do it. That is an impairment, right? Not just, oh, my mood's been off for a while. And most of the diagnoses have timelines too. So we're not just looking at a day, or sometimes I feel this way and sometimes I don't. Okay, so that's probably not a disorder, right? That's our emotions are normal human experiences. We don't need to over pathologize them, and we need to be more sensitive to others who do have these disorders. And when we start throwing around terms and we use them incorrectly, it's invalidating, right? And if anything, it keeps people from seeking help. So if I'm using a mental health disorder as an adjective to describe something, right? There's this negative connotation to it. And so if there's somebody else in the room who's struggling either with that disorder or a different disorder, well, now they don't want to get help because it's looked at as this
Exactly.
negative thing.
Yeah, no, I definitely understand that. Definitely understand that. Yeah, and I want to thank you for, I guess, allowing us with your presence because of one, all the educational background that you've also brought with your life experience, and for me, that is one of the biggest factors that allowed me to become vulnerable,
Mm-hmm.
seeking help and getting help from the experts that also dealt with this lively, you know what I mean? And that understands and that can empathize, and that's just not there to assess.
Mm-hmm.
Something that we go through as athletes, as just individuals, as veterans. We get assessed to the point where we don't trust and we can't be vulnerable. And now our resource for receiving help has literally been blocked by our own, I guess, assessments that we do, you know? So it's something that I would like to thank you for, and being there for the people and making this change. And I want to ask you, how can people reach out to you? How can people follow you? How can people learn from you?
Sure. So you can follow me on ImpactWayv at Dr. Cav, as you can see below. So I post on there regularly just different tips and things that you can do to help yourself. So um, getting help is wonderful, right? And you don't even need to have a mental disorder to get help. You may just want to have better coping skills or better resources, because these things aren't taught to us, right? We kind of just have to figure it out on our own, which is crazy. right? Why aren't we putting this in our school curriculum? Why aren't we learning self-regulation techniques? And again, Dom, like you were saying, many people grow up more so in survival mode all the time. So you can't even access these things because you're just trying to get your basic needs met, right? And when you put generational trauma on top of that, there's certainly more barriers and it makes it harder to access care for sure.
Definitely harder to break. Definitely harder to break. And for me, you guys can find me on Instagram at Easy91,
Mhm.
as well as on more podcasts coming up with ImpactWayv. So I definitely want you guys to tune in. Thank you guys for tuning in. Join me again on June 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern for a chat with the executive and and mental performance from Coach Dr. Brian Levison. So please, thank you for tuning in to Impact Wave, where we're trying to make a difference.